Hello, Simon Fairfax here again with another video for my YouTube channel. Again, this time on Westerns. And I wanted to touch on something which is very dear to my heart. Before we go any further, if you would subscribe and like my channel, I'd be very grateful. That is, if you want to hear some more about the writings and research behind my books and why I write what I write. Now, today, I want to talk about authenticity. In Westerns, it's very, very important. And I don't just mean about getting necessarily the clothes right, but it's the whole thing. The point about Westerns is that there are two aspects. There's the authenticity of the action, the horses, the guns, the gunfights, and there's also the authenticity of the scenery, what can be done in the time, and how the scenery affects and the environment affects the nature of the story. Now, when we look at guns, of course, you've got to make sure that you get it right. And I've done a lot of research on this, even though I haven't actually fired a Colt 45 in earnest. But you have to bear in mind small things that get ignored in the famous cowboy films, that a Colt 45 at that time, the bullet would quite happily go through 4 or 5 walls of a typical saloon, town, any kind of building within the West at that time. A lot of people, a lot of marshals in the towns actually chose to use smaller loads so that they wouldn't have a danger of killing someone innocent on the other side of the wall. These small details matter. Now, the weapons they used and the distances. How many times have we watched a cowboy film and you've seen the hero or even the baddie turn round and shoot 20 shots out of his nominal 6-gun, or he takes the gun and aims in the distance like this over 100 yards and shoots someone out of his horse? We know it's not going to work. Yeah, it makes good cinema, but in books, I think we have to be a little bit more realistic than actually doing that. So I've done a lot of research. I've got a brilliant book actually called The Writer's Guide to the Everyday Life in the West, which doesn't necessarily touch on weapons, but it does give authenticity to what I'm trying to achieve in my books, which hopefully I get across. And if you, dear reader, spot some errors, then please forgive me, because I'm only human. It also is the same with the Indian tribes. Now, I have a real love and I found a fascination with the Comanche nation. The Comanche, of all the Indians, were the most interesting, because we never think, watching Westerns and reading books or fiction, that Indians fighting Indians. Yet the Comanche were known as the enemy by the rest of the Indian tribes, and Comanche stretched all the way at one point from right on the southern border of Mexico right the way up through a whole swathe of what was then the Indian nations, is now Oklahoma, right up to the top, all the way across the western side of the western states. And it's fascinating to see that. And the Comanche themselves are an incredible tribe. They were also quite unusual, because I studied their whole history. I read this brilliant book, The Comanche Empire by Pakahamalainen, and excuse my pronunciation, and also The Empire of the Summer Moon, which was about the whole story, a biography really, of Quanapaka, who was an incredible character, and I could talk for hours just on him alone. But that book inspired the name of the 3rd book in my series, Comanche Moon, because the Comanche were unusual. The only other tribe I know of, and I may be wrong here, is the Kiowa, who would actually attack at night. The rest of the tribes wouldn't, because they believe that Kadai, the Great Spirit, wouldn't be able to find them. And that's why down in Texas, when they see a moon like that, they call it the Comanche moon, because that's what the Comanches used to attack. But these fascinating facts in their stories and their traditions and how they worked as a tribe, I found absolutely incredible. The other interesting thing is that the Comanche were the only tribe, apart from the Nez who bred the Appaloosas, that actually took on a breeding program for the horses. And they brought them on and bred strains. And following on from that, this is what changed their power, because they weren't necessarily big compared to some of the tribes, but they fought actually into battle on horseback. And this was really unusual. You see all the Western films, so they ride up. Yeah, they used to ride up, but then they dismount, especially the Apache, and attack on foot. Not the Comanche. They came in with war lances, right up on horseback, using their ponies as war ponies in the traditional sense of the word. The whole thing fits together really well. I just find it absolutely fascinating. But in terms of authenticity, it wasn't just that. It was also the biographies of the gunfighters. Now, they're portrayed on films as being maybe not the most intelligent, and they're typical good old cowboys that fell into guns. But I read and have a lot of biographies of, yes, there are the classic gunfighters that we've heard of, Wyatt Earp, Wes Hardin, and Curly Bill Brocious as a baddie, and the Dueling Gang and Doc Holliday. But there were other incredible characters, including Luke Short, Charlie Bassett, who was actually an Englishman, a bit like my character, and King Fisher and Ben Thompson. These characters had the most amazing history, and they were also quite intelligent. Now, when you read about them, you want to try and understand what drove them, what they were like. Now, reading Bat Masterson's biography, which again is an amazing story, he tried to analyze what made a really good gunfighter. He said you had to have courage. And he said all of those people above, and he saw a lot of gunfights, and he said both men had courage, but it wasn't enough. They also had to have the ability and the experience with weapons, which a lot of them did. But the first two, he said that he has seen gunfighters go down when he expected them to win, or other people did, with those first two abilities to 100%. But the one thing he said they needed above all else was deliberation. And for that, in his terms, mean determination to see it through, not to be phased, to have ice cold nerves, and to stand there, take a shot, fire back, and kill your opponent. And this, more than anything, he said, determined the outcome of a gunfight. Now, when I'm trying to inhabit the minds and mentalities of my heroes, this is what I have to get inside their heads. I have to live there and understand what it was that's driving them and how it actually drives them. And it was often the intelligence as well, because if you think how much the language has changed over the years since the black and white films of the 30s, 40s, 50s, to even present day films, and we think, oh yeah, well, that's how the cowboys spoke. In reality, they didn't. I want to read a couple of extracts of gunfighters with their direct conversations at the time that have been recorded. Now, one of them is Wyatt Earp. And he says, when he's trying to help Luke Short, one of the gunmen I'm going to talk about, he says to open a saloon when the mayor didn't want him to. Mr. Mayor, and the gentleman of meetings, said Wyatt, I guess the report is true. I came here some days ago, said he, and, thinking that perhaps something might happen where I would need assistance, brought along some other gentlemen who signified a willingness to join in whatever festivities might arise. Does that sound like a typical 1860s gunfighter of the films? No. Moreover, continued Wyatt, Luke and Bat will arrive at noon tomorrow, and on their arrival we expect to open up hostilities. Now look here, Wyatt, said the mayor, you have no better friends than anywhere than here. We don't want any more fighting in this town. That sounds more like the dialogue we expect. But it wasn't, and then Luke Short, who grew up to be he was called a white Indian growing up. He had no education and was literally an Indian except for the colour of his skin. He said on this subject, very well, said Luke. There is, however, another thing I would wish to call to your notice. You had an ordinance passed by the City Council prohibiting music in saloons. I want that ordinance repealed. Mr. Sheriff, you also have 2 men in your office that are objectionable to me, and I would like to have you remove them. This does not sound like a typical gunfighter as we imagined it to be. And then we turn to Bill Tileman. Bill Tileman was an incredible gunfighter, and his biography could fill whole books just by itself. So here's this gunfighter that wasn't perhaps typically how we imagine gunfighters to be. He was in the Indian Nations. He just fought off a load of Indians. His partner gets back and he said, the scrap is over, said Billy, when the boys got near enough to hear him, and 3 of the hounds have made their escape. I told you last night, didn't I, Henry, that I would kill all that came if they stood their ground and didn't run away? Well, he said in a rather disconsolate tone of voice, I fell down somewhat on my calculations as 7 came, and I only succeeded in getting 4. But then, that wasn't so bad, considering they left us their ponies. Does that sound like Clint Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars when he turns around and says, My mistake, old man. 4. Not really the same, is it? And this is how so many of the cowboys, or the gunfighters, my heroes and my baddies in my books, actually spoke. Because the West at that time was a huge melting pot of Europeans that had come over, and there was no traditional language in the way that we imagine it today, of the Western drawl or the more nasally Northern accents that we hear on television. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to me and talk some more about the books that I have such fun writing, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.